Hi, my name is Matthew Bertel, and in this video I will talk about the social effects of growing up as an only child. So, what do you think of when you meet someone who's an only child? If you're like most people, you probably think that they're spoiled, pampered, and think that the world will give them everything. And you probably think all of this because you think that they were given everything as a child. They were given all of their parents' attention, all of their parents' care, all of their parents' love, a lot of their money, and a lot of gifts too. You probably also think that only children are self-centered, overindulgent, and have a hard time relating to other people. And you probably think all of this because they never grew up with siblings and had to deal with them every single day. If you think that some or all of these stereotypes are true, then I'm sad to inform you that these stereotypes are false and misleading. I want to educate you on why they are false and they are misleading. But first, let me tell you why you believe in these false and misleading stereotypes. And it's very simple. It's because up until recently, psychologists thought that all of these stereotypes were true. They thought that students were thought that only children were self-centered. They thought that only children had hard times relating with other people. They thought that they were pampered and spoiled and expected the world to give them everything. But more recently, findings have found that these psychologists were wrong. Now, these more modern findings were a result of greater interest in the topic due to the Chinese one-child policy. Now, this one-child policy was passed by China in an effort to reduce the population. By reducing population, they limited families to one child only. Now, by reducing to one child only, they increased the amount of only children. And by increasing the amount of only children, they have increased interest in the topic of what are the social effects on only children. So by increasing these topics, they forced psychologists to come up and create and develop and perform new studies that test the social effects on only children. So these tests started being produced in the 80s and the 90s, and they studied only children. And what they found was that only children were more goal-oriented, that they were more respectful of authority, and they stressed a desire for structure. They also found that they had a greater chance to have an increase in intellectual development than non-only children. And they found all this while also finding that these stereotypes were false. Now these were findings in the 80s and 90s. Now more modern findings have found that while the stereotypes still exist around only children, that personality-wise they're actually not, there's no difference between an only child and a non-only child. They found that there's no differences between the two. In another study recently conducted, Chinese students with behavioral problems were studied. Researchers looked at children with behavioral problems, and they also looked to find the reasons behind the behavioral problems. Specific reasons that they looked for were being an only child, but also being a child who lives in the city, a child who lives in a rural area, a child who is bullied, and versus a child who wasn't bullied. And this study found that behavioral problems were formed from stress, living in the city, living in the rural areas, being bullied, but not from being an only child. Only children were found to be just as likely to have behavioral problems just as much as non-only children. In another recent study, children with siblings were compared to children without siblings on gender atypical behavior. In this study, children in China were studied through a personal and parental survey. Now this survey asked both the parents and the children what type of activities and games the children played in. Depending on the answers and the sex of the child, it was determined if the child participated in a high amount of atypical behaviors or a low amount of atypical behaviors. And this study found that for both boys and girls, only children did not differ from children without siblings on the amount of gender atypical behaviors. Another only child survey that was also conducted recently in China studied the mental health of students. Now, This survey was given to high school students in rural and urban areas, and it asks them basic general health questions and to self-evaluate themselves in numerous areas, including depression, self-esteem, anxiety-prone tendencies, interpersonal dependency behaviors, personal stress, and love awareness. The result of these surveys showed that no significant difference was observed between rural-only and non-only children. The results, though, of the urban children showed that there were differences in depression, anxiety, and stress, and it showed that only children did show a higher tendency to have all three of these things. But the survey did say that these children who lived in the city were more likely to come from poor families, which would be a reason for the high levels of stress and anxiety and the high levels of depression. Now, the survey also said that since the findings found that rural-only students did not differ from non-only students, that in general, being an only child does not affect your mental health. Now, these modern studies and surveys are just a small example of what's going on in the research and testing world of testing only children and how they're socially affected, but they have all found that an only child does not have a significant impact. Being an only child does not have a significant impact on a child socially. And these modern experiments, though they have not been able to put old stereotypes to rest, have proven that these stereotypes are false. And hopefully, with the continued study on only children and an entire generation growing up in China of only children, that this stereotype will be put to rest. And I hope you, by watching this video, will put these stereotypes aside, because only children are not what they seem. They are normal. They do not have any social effects at all. And I hope that's what you got out of this video. Thank you.